Okay. The exciting silent opening of the steam thing. One of these days we'll work out the sound part. Oh, I can imagine all the little clickety-clack sounds of the clocks and the typewriters and all the other fun stuff here. And my Troubles in Paradise project. I'm Rulin James Downard. WordPress.com, WordPress.com, my website. For all of you out there who do not have it on your speed tap or at your home computer or wherever else, why the hell not? Because the information can't do anybody good if people aren't actually using it. So we've got a nice guest today, Jackson. You'll only be able to be here for a little bit, but you're coming into the show.
I can be here for the whole time.
Test or something that you had to get off to at 5:30.
Oh no, I just took that test. It's 7 here now.
Oh well, that's marvelous. Bravo. Okay, we're covered. The topic is about a creationist who caused my mammalian jaw to drop, Nathaniel Jeanson. I found out about this through the scuttlebutt in a bunch of different people, and I finally did the source search on it and found somebody who'd called attention to it. That Nathaniel Jeanson, who's a young Earth creationist geneticist, and he published a bunch of stuff in Answers in Genesis. In one of his responses to a guy from Biologos, Venema, he announced that, creationists actually accept transitional fossil forms. We have no problem with that. God can make transitional fossils like mad. And you're going, what? And there was a link I put up to Jim Pithecus, who is a Christian paleoanthropologist, that was going, what? And calling attention to a variety of the creationists over the years, as everybody who's ever studied this subject knows, from both creationism and intelligent design, they don't accept transitional fossils at all. You can never get them to acknowledge that there's any such thing that qualifies as a transitional form. And so to see him just tossing this off ex cathedra out in the middle of nowhere puts him in a really unusual position. I can see the argument there because it can diffuse it. He's also trying to argue, as I was looking in his new book that just came out, the new Origin of Species thing, he's making a lot of arguments that's basically accepting super duper high speed speciation. And he's got a bunch of charts where he's basically saying that organisms can speciate in just a few hundred years. And in some cases, some of his numbers get very troublesome. So I've been writing material down just before the show started out. Beej asks, are these young transitional fossils or old? Yes, yes. He doesn't get that far to talk about actual examples. And of course, anybody that knows about reptile-mammal transition or dinosaurs or tetrapods or whale evolution or human evolution or echinoderms or anything else you care to look at, there's a lot of fossils out there. And there's a lot of details to deal with. And he just skips the detail part. Brian says hi, I see. So it's a really amazing thing. We'll see whether or not Jenson's argument carries weight anywhere, or whether this is just one of those what moments that you pop up with every once in a while, like when Andrew Snelling about 20 years ago tried to argue there was more than one flood because he was aware of the fact that there's this interbedded volcanic ash in the geological deposit, and that didn't set well, and he backed off of that in a hurry. So jump in, Jackson, and give us your take on this matter.
Well, I definitely agree. This is certainly an odd claim for him to make. Usually, as far as I'm aware, when they come across, or when the creationists come across, what we would call transitional fossils, they say, oh, this is a mosaic of features that God created for, whatever reason, biodiversity's sake, I guess.
Yeah.
But they never say it's transitional.
Yeah, and you can easily test this out. You don't have to take my word for it. Whenever you look at anybody talking about transitional forms, see if they put down specifications of what they would accept. When you look at a regular evolutionary thing where they're talking about why Archaeopteryx is transitional between reptiles and birds, they're going to list off a whole bunch of features that it has anatomically that links it in terms of actual bone structure and other features with the reptile forms. And you'll find that when the anti-evolutionist tries to cover this, they're not mentioning what they would accept. They're not putting criteria down. They're just either they're finding reasons to reject it as a transitional fossil, but I've never seen anybody from Dwayne Gish, who wrote the fossil transitions are all false, and everybody that pops along on this line, it's such a bucking the trend approach that you have to wonder whether or not he's actually in kind of this weird world of making it up as he goes along stuff that you normally find at lower level creationists. You don't typically find that at that higher level on that, offer an argument that's so completely off the wall of their own literature. But everybody in this area that you bump into refuses to allow transitionals to exist. Kent Hovind, as we know, takes the argument that, well, no, you can't ever prove that anything is related to anything in his context, that you can't prove a fossil, you have no idea that the fossil ever had babies. Well, no, but would one that did look any different? In which case, yeah, you don't have that example. So it's going to be fascinating to see. As far as I can tell from scanning through his work, it looks like Jeanson takes the argument that kinds are kind of at the family level, which is the traditional approach to the thing. He doesn't seem to cite much of the baraminology literature and others. So he's operating entirely from kind of a genetic level and relating only to living organisms. He's not a paleontologist. So when he brought up in the book that I was looking through, he had Archaeopteryx, but he doesn't have anything on theropods. He doesn't have anything on the therapsids. He doesn't have anything on any of the fossil data on that stuff. He glances past the horse sequence at like 90 miles an hour. So hopefully I'll be able to get a chance to look more at his footnote references to find out what he's using as his documentation field on that, which is, of course, where they're going to screw up.
Yeah, I mean, just today, and over the past 2 days, I have been sparring with a creationist who is particularly interested in the theropod bird transition, and yet he says there are no transitional fossils.
Hi, Shannon. Shannon showed up.
Hey,
we were looking
Shannon.
forward to you.
Forgot they can't see. We can't hear you.
Yes, are you muted?
Hi.
There you go. Yeah, this was
about
a fun one where we're going into the gobsmacking concession that Nathaniel Jeanson, the young Earth creationist geneticist, suddenly did, where he is saying, oh, we creationists accept transitional fossils. We have no problem with them. God can make transitional fossils. That's no difficulty at all. And you're going, what?
Oh my God. I read Replacing Darwin.
Oh,
and now
my condolences, but I got to quiz you on it. That's great because somebody had to look at that. I was just looking through the
bad.
Amazon.
It's bad. I can never do a jigsaw puzzle again. At the beginning of every chapter, like the entire thing is a huge jigsaw puzzle analogy, and it's really sorry about my appearance. I wasn't ready to do this, but I heard you were talking about Nathaniel, and I had to be involved.
I am glad to do it because I was just looking through. I hadn't known about his new book, and so somebody called it to my attention. And so I looked over at Amazon where I could get a partial preview. So I was hunting up for words. I was just getting notes on it where the stuff that he doesn't mention, therapsids, synapsids, theropods, bone morphological protein, macroevolution, microevolution. There's one brief reference to dinosaurs. For somebody who wants to dispose and explain a huge data field, he manages to miss a lot.
Yeah, like it's essentially the entire book is a poor mathematical argument for entropy. So he's essentially saying that there's such a high mutation rate in hominid DNA that if we accept that mutation rate, then we would have mutated our DNA into oblivion by now, which it is ridiculous because it's almost like affirming evolution because mutations happen in
and
DNA.
Plus, of course, he has to cram everything into a very vague context. I was listing off. He's got a whole bunch of stuff that I was seeing, some of which was available to view and others weren't, but I couldn't get at the references. So I'll love to quiz you and get some information later on this. But like in the pages 255 on, he has a whole bunch of charts on supposedly linear speciation rates. And how there's been a purely linear speciation among cows and foxes and felids and a whole bunch of stuff and squirrels and that. And he's got dates at the bottom, time since differentiation, that sounds like he's thinking all this is happening in like the last 1600, 1800 years, like after Jesus?
And he even like based on, because he essentially kind of did his math backwards, and based on his math, he'll even say that the Earth is probably, or the human race is probably about 12,000 years old.
Ooh, wow.
So,
That's
right, yeah.
liberal.
Right? Yeah.
Well, at least they're getting closer to the actual time.
Right.
Well,
but
They're at
minus
least
a
starting
few
in the right
zeros.
direction.
Yeah, you know,
I wish I
if he
could
keeps
use
it
my
up and brings a
Kindle
couple
better.
more zeros in there.
Because I highlighted
Jeanson,
so many ridiculous, like there's so many. I'm pretty sure I sent Jackson one ages ago. Jackson, and you referred me to PZ Myers because he had made
I think so.
this insane mathematical claim. I can't even remember what it was. It's been so long since I read it, and I really wish that I could
one's
go.
mind gets inured to the number of insane mathematical claims that show up in creationist literature. It's what I call jujitsu arguments. It's ones where it's that they have a desire for the slam dunk. They want to have the killer, and nothing is better than mathematics. So if they can come up with the formula that absolutely proves that evolution cannot work, bingo, that's it. That's mathematical certainty, QED. But it depends on their assumptions, and it depends on the data field, and it depends on the examples, and then that's when it starts falling apart.
Like the math may even be okay. Like I've got the book itself up right here.
Bright screen.
Yeah, you know, you can't see it?
Yeah.
But it's just awful. Like they essentially take humans now and do the time scale backwards. And what his entire argument is based on what we know are static mutation rates. If we work backwards, it would have to be a maximum of 12,000 years. Otherwise, we would have already mutated into just,
so
we would have degraded.
Dogs and cats living together.
What are his thoughts on mitochondrial haplogroups?
What are his thoughts or my thoughts? I don't have any thoughts on mitochondria.
Does he mention haplogroups?
Well, the one thing I did quote him on was that he said to page 248 in Jeanson's new books, creationists and evolutionists agree that mitochondrial DNA trees represent the history of speciation within the family. Oh my. That's going to be a concession that's going to bite him.
Yeah,
because he has to have all of that stuff within a family. He never seems to talk about genera. He jumps right up to the family level. And of course, in some cases, at the family level, fossil data is extremely sparse. Bats, for example, I think most of the bat families aren't known by fossil record at all. And so he is immediately pulling the data field down and dealing with it. But what bothered me about so much of the stuff that he was arguing is that he didn't offer sources for it. He said that some of them are from I've compiled this chart from publicly accessible sources. Would you like to give us those so we could check too?
He does do citations and references. I went into his footnotes because I can't even remember. It's been a while since I read it, and I pushed so much of it out of my mind because there was times that I literally had to. I read the entire thing on my phone. I literally had to throw it down and walk away from it because I was so just infuriated by it, and it's an act of obfuscation too.
Do you still have the book?
I do. I'm actually searching through it for haploid.
Oh, good. Because I'd like to pick your brain because if I can't get access to the footnotes, there's someone who's put a link up so that theoretically I can see the whole book. And if so, then I'm covered. Okay. But if not, I'll be hitting you up for the footnote references because as you all know from my source methods, that's what I want to see. You can make any claim you like, but I want to see what source you're offering for it. And if it's a bold head up the ass claim, you better have a bold head up the ass extractor.
Actually, I'm looking at the footnotes right now. Most of the haploid references are in his footnotes, not in the body of his actual book.
Yeah, I know he did a couple papers on mitochondrial DNA and Neanderthals and that, and he's probably reprising the stuff that he did in that for Answers in Genesis, because creationists are not exactly the most original people. They tend to.
What?
I know this is shocking. I know you won't. You will not be able to believe this, Jackson.
I'm shocked, sir. Shocked.
Yes. For all of those who have never seen Casablanca. You should all recognize that we are alluding to the famous scene in Casablanca. If you haven't seen it, see it, damn it. It's a great movie. where Inspector Renault has to break up Rick's cafe on a pretense because the Germans are insisting that he do. And so he comes in there and says, "Oh, I'm shocked to discover the gambling is going on in this establishment." And the croupier comes over and says, "Here's your winnings, sir." And, "Oh, thank you, thank you." And he stuffs them in his pocket while he's closing down the thing. So I'm shocked. Shocked is the acronym for anybody that is feigning amazement at something that actually isn't amazing at all.
Okay, so yeah, I found a mitochondrial DNA reference.
Ooh.
Okay, so do you want me to read it?
Oh yeah, yes, please do. This is show and tell time.
Okay, so this is from chapter 3 in his book. Okay. The first human sequences were from an unusual location. As we alluded to in the previous chapter, most of our DNA is contained in 46 chromosomes, but not all of it. In terms of physical location, these chromosomes reside in the subcellular compartment termed the nucleus, figure 3.9. In the 1960s, DNA was detected elsewhere in a different subcellular compartment termed the mitochondria. With respect to the energy transformation functions we discussed earlier, mitochondria are the major sites, figure 3.9. They contain numerous proteins involved in breaking down nutrients and coupling this to synthesis of ATP. Perhaps not surprisingly then, when human mitochondrial DNA was sequenced in 1981, investigators discovered that it was chock full of DNA sequences that coded for energy transformation proteins. It didn't code for all the proteins that reside in the mitochondria, but it was tightly packed with genes. For the next several years, the main genomes that were cracked were more viruses. The sizes of the sequenced genomes increased with time from 5,000 bases of the bacteriophage Phi X174 genome in 1977 to the 237,000 base pair genome of the human. And yeah, and then it goes on for a little bit. He's just talking about DNA sequencings, but that's one of the only references to mitochondrial that I found.
Jackson in the side chat, in the internal chat here, that you guys on the show can't see, a subcellular compartment. Interesting phrasing. Do you think that's him quietly snubbing endosymbiosis? I was literally thinking exactly the same thing. So check in the book for his index. It's got an index, right?
Does. Yep.
If so, check for endosymbiosis. He's got a glossary too.
He does. Yeah. Endosymbiosis. Yeah.
That was the subcellular compartment. Just that.
The wording.
That phrasing. I was like, that's not really a phrase that you hear in a microbiology class.
So he's got a section on endosymbiosis.
Well, let me look. So endosymbiosis, I'm just going to make ENDO.
Because if he doesn't, to avoid that subject in a 2017 book is like writing about Earth geography and pretending that plate tectonics isn't there.
Endosymbiosis, searching for references in the entire book, including the glossary. No results.
Nothing?
No results.
Oh, bingo, bongo.
I searched the whole book. No results.
No endosymbiosis.
This is a fun game. I mean, this is like replacing Darwin bingo.
And there's a ton of mitochondria in every cell. I mean, there's not just one. And they've all got their own little proprietary DNA. And the reason why they do is because they are endosymbiotically derived from a bad case of bacterial indigestion a couple billion years ago.
Makes you wonder what he thinks of nucleomorphs.
Oh, gosh, you guys are so much smarter than me.
Well, only that. Well, Jackson is hot on the ball. I marvel at how he can rattle off a lot of these taxa names. Just my tongue would be tangling up constantly. But I've just been at my end of it a long time. I mean, I've been researching this stuff for decades. So bit by bit, little things, balls fall in the Pokemon, the little pachinko thingy, and I actually can figure out what the hell is going on and remember it pretty well. But it's only because I've been at it a long time.
Can I ask you what you think of one of the highlight sections that I have? Like when I was going through, I highlighted so many things because you can do that in the Kindle. Just because I didn't have the Kindle.
I was just looking at him online. I was looking through key phrases. Immediately, I wanted to know what he had to say about fossils. I wanted to see what he had to say about the reptile-mammal transition, which I was expecting he didn't, and he didn't. And so I'm looking at what isn't on his data field.
Oh, okay.
I just got a question
Probably
up here
lots.
in the live chat from Animal Man. Do I think the creationists accept the melanosomes found in fossil animals, most famously dinosaurs? Probably, because that would be an example of tissue preservation. In fact, that's the one time he mentioned dinosaurs, which was on 190. He was talking about the dinosaur soft tissues, and even then he didn't supply a source.
Oh, the Mary Schweitzer thing, probably. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they like that stuff. There's a body of buzzwords that they'll latch onto, and they're happy to look at. But I agree that subcellular compartment thing. Wow, isn't that just amazing?
Mary Schweitzer actually does things other than just Tyrannosaur soft tissue. She also works with endothermy.
Yeah, and you know, in the regular field, admittedly, she had a row to hoe because there was always the possibility of contamination, and it still comes up as an issue about whether or not how easy it is, especially when you're doing that PCM stuff where they're simply duplicating the gene, the genetic material to get enough of it so that you can look at it. Any of those kinds of stuff can theoretically amplify the tiniest amount. Even when you're doing clean room stuff, it's very, very difficult to get it clean enough because tiny fragments of stuff, DNA is like really tiny and pieces of it are really tinier. So it's understandable that happens. Yeah, incredible. And so some of the stuff that they thought was like dinosaur DNA, there was a thing that went back quite a few years ago when the techniques were fairly new, were just human or bird contaminants and other kinds of stuff that weren't anything related to that. Animal Man goes on, don't accept feathered dinosaurs, though, which most of the known dinosaur melanosomes come from. Yeah, the feathered dinosaurs is a thing where young Earth creationists and intelligent designers go all kumbaya, and they all can't stand the idea of a feathered dinosaur because that's really transitional, isn't it? They've got to have feathers originate just in birds. And so they scramble around, and it was easier for them to do that 20 years ago before we started finding all of these damn feathered theropods. But the yin yang, and you find, I went into a lot of this in Evolution Slam Dunk, book plug, where
I saw Caproni had it the other day, and I was like, "Yeah,
yeah." Well, I'd like to see people act on that and actually buy the damn thing. So that's I'd get more people do that and tell everybody and pester book reviewers to take notice of it and call it attention to Jerry Coyne and all the rest. You know, I mean, tell them, hey, this thing is out here. He's done something nobody's done before. So anyway,
right. Well, because you focused on the
feathers in the book. Yeah, I brought up the feather example because not only is it a case of where they're using the same bloody genes, that the systems that generate keratin structures with feathers in birds are generating hair in mammals, but they look a bit different, obviously, because of the evagination-invagination issue and stuff that was occurring way deep in the diapsid-synapsid divide, long before there were dinosaurs or birds. And the other factor is that you've got the fact that you've got so many different routes to feathers, and the developmental biology of this has been worked out, and anti-evolutionists skate around this like mad. So Michael Denton and Jonathan Wells and all these others that have complained about feathered theropods, and then of course they always invoke Alan Fiducia as their authority figure, have to stay one step behind the increasingly massive data curve. And so we've got a matter now where, good gravy, even though we don't have a good benchmark for what happened before Archaeopteryx, we got a hell of a busy world after it. So from the period from the late Jurassic on into the Cretaceous, you've got a bunch of different flappy bird-like dinosaur forms, some of which could fly, some of which couldn't, some of which have feathers on all four wings, some of them have bat membrane style things with a little bit of feathers. I mean, there's just an amazing variety.
That was a weird one.
Yeah, and that was just come up. That was another one where Brian Naish called attention to the paleontologist who predicted that fossil was going to have a membrane. It was going to be a bat-like form that she was telling from what the anatomy was. And that's why when there was just a stupid creationist, this guy Steven, who is a recent Roman Catholic and not a recent thinker, is insisting paleontology is all lies. That's all their presumptions and all of that. And of course, he hasn't actually read any paleontology. So I said it's kind of like somebody who's tone deaf trying to complain about Yo-Yo Ma's cello playing.
Well, I mean, RJ, that would require actually understanding paleontology or cello playing, whatever the analogy is. And that's hard.
Yeah,
Can I
and
read you guys some
although
highlights
it's
from the book when you guys are
absolutely.
done?
We need
I
a
want to
rip
get your
tickler.
opinion. I've been dying to talk to somebody about this book. I've been super quiet because and you guys are so clever.
This is the place.
But I have
This
like a million highlighted sections that I was like, what the actual beep word is he trying to get here? So like, listen to this. Okay, so the DNA was about 10 times less. Going the other direction on the DNA scale. Some amphibians had 10 times more DNA than humans. Lungfish had nearly 20 times as much. If DNA was the blueprint for life, the amount of blueprint didn't have a clear relationship with the amount of complexity of the creature that was to be built.
Yeah, this is an amazingly stupid thing for a geneticist to say. And even worse for like a developmental biologist. It's relating to the C value thing is why are there the number of genes that we have in particular organisms or not? And in the old days, when they didn't realize alternative splicing and when they didn't know about homeobox genes and they didn't know about the vast majority of the stuff that we now know in the last 20 years, that it was a bigger problem than it is now. To where the idea that when you got polyploidy, there's a variety of organisms that just multiply the genes like mad, and they have multiple copies of the same thing. So they have monstrously large genomes, but they have a lot of redundancy in them. And there's probably dynamic selection pressures on that because they can find a lot of different ways to combat parasites, and there's a whole bunch of other little fiddly bits that go in. But the other factor is that just within the last 20 years, when they were looking at the human genome, they were expecting, since we got like 100,000 proteins, that we would be expecting there to be 100,000 genes. Duh. That was the old view of things in the nice gene-centered stuff that was the world of Richard Dawkins as of 1980. That kind of worldview. And then they found, no, there's only 25,000 genes, and every single gene is just being alternative spliced like mad to generate multiple proteins from the same thing. And it proved tremendously exciting because it shows you the dynamisms of how the actual biological kludgy systems connect and pull up stuff and generate all that stuff. It relates to that junk DNA issue, which is how much of the genome is actually not used for something at the moment, but gets replicated anyway, and it gets transcribed but not used, and the junk crew comes in and cleans away whatever proteins you aren't using and all of that. And so it's a very messy environment going on down at the cellular level. And ultimately, and Jackson can bear me out on this as to whether or not this rings true for his research, because he's done stuff on origins of multicellularity and all that, is that what we're seeing in all of this messiness in the genome transcription system are some of the ghosts of very long ago biological process shifts that are probably tracing back billions of years, and we're still seeing them going on today in newer contexts. But it's because the earlier biological systems would be trading information back and forth like mad when everything was bacteria. We still see that in lateral gene transfer today. It's much, much rarer when you get up into vertebrates and that sort of thing. And so we got all of these little ghosts and things that have lessons to tell, except to people like Jeanson, who is looking at a very static, created kind, fixed world of design where all of the design was good. And there's another one to look it up. ALU. Find out whether he's got an index for ALU.
Oh, okay. Well, give me 1 second. I found your fossil references.
Yeah,
so,
not many.
Yay. So
he
wrote a whole chapter. Either. Chapter 4 is called The Riddle of Geography, and that might be the one that made me the most.
Ooh, sounds like biogeography, maybe.
Yeah, because
it's intense. Okay, so let me read the section that I pulled out from when I was reading it and see what you guys make of it. So this is from like page 1 through like 3. So consider the weakness of the data available to him. And when they're talking about him, they're talking about Darwin. By the way, anytime it says him, it's Darwin.
It should be like capital H for him.
Capital H, asterisk.
Dun, dun, dun.
Consider the weakness of the data available to him. Fossils didn't directly record genealogical relationships. As we discussed in chapter 2, fossils inform ancestry only after a model of genetics is assumed. Thus, fossil insights to the question of ancestry must follow the discovery of genetics. They cannot precede it. Since Darwin wrote on the origin of species before genetics was even a scientific field, fossils could not have rigorously informed the ancestry question. Similarly, geography doesn't directly record inheritance. As an illustration, I have a closer genealogical relationship with people several thousand miles away, my maternal relatives live in Germany, than I do with my next door neighbors.
Oh, what a wonderfully evasive things.
I was screaming on my end. Just saying.
Yeah, did you mute yourself and yell a lot?
Access to automobiles and ocean liners, then they too could have a much more complicated biological history. In fact, we know that biological mutation rates and various other things have a new modality in the advent of railroad trains, because people started marrying people that were like 50 or 100 miles away, where they never did that before. But the initial premise, and you notice he doesn't discuss specific examples here. My mammalian jaw is dropping, because you could tell a ton about biological relationships from the developmental biology in the fossils, independent of knowing how the genes connected up. You knew that all mammals start out with the reptile jaw layout in their embryology. This was known in the 1830s, and he is never going to bump into it, because literally no creationist ever does. It's just off their scope. And then when you start looking at fossil relationships in terms of structures, even Richard Owen, who was a non-evolutionist, nonetheless had to see relationships and connective tendencies to kind of stuff. I think my image is occasionally jerking up on the feed here, and hopefully people will not have the weird idea that I'm going through a teleporter spasm or something in the middle of everything. But, look, bear with us, just close your eyes and listen, and things should be okay.
I have so many more ridiculous excerpts for you too. It's just a cavalcade of insanity.
I gotta say,
it is.
I gotta say,
another one. I want to have more. This is fun.
Let Jackson say what he's going to say, and then I have another one that has to do with why rodents are or are not on islands that you guys will really enjoy, I'm sure.
Wait, why rodents are not on islands?
Yeah. So
yeah. What are we going to say, Jackson?
Oh, okay. Well, anyways, so the thing about how phylogeny doesn't correlate with biogeography. Oh my god. Oh my god. That's not even wrong.
Yeah, it's just colossally bad. And that one of the areas that's going to be featured in that I got a massive material that I have in a great big stack of unprocessed stuff that I have in my bibliography, but hopefully I can do a book on it later, is on that whole biogeography matter.
Oh yeah,
this is a subject matter that anti-evolutionists are terrible at.
Oh, one of my favorite papers is I actually got to attend the lecture. I know I've told RJ about this, is on the pitcher plant Sarracenia. Basically, this pitcher plant forms an obligatory relationship with these arthropods, mostly flies and moths, and then there are some spiders, but they're not obligate in this relationship. So Sarracenia was on one side of the Mississippi River, and for one reason or another,
that was a fascinating one.
Yeah, some seeds got dispersed on the other side, and the flies, the flesh flies that were associated with this pitcher plant, they moved to the other side to the new pitcher plants. So when the pitcher plants on the other side of the Mississippi speciated, the flesh flies that had gone over there also speciated simultaneously.
Right.
Yeah, and so this is direct evidence that phylogeny correlates with biogeography. Yeah. And to even say something so monumentally ridiculous.
Oh, it gets better.
I mean,
yeah.
Darwin's
Before Shannon reads her excerpt, let me do up we're about halfway through the show here, and I'm going to do one of my patron nods for RJ's tip patrons, Stephen and Dyer and Eat and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody and Daniel and Ralph and Eric and Benjamin and Staggles and Alex and Totas Real, Everett and Paul. Thank you all so much for having supported the project. I'm plugging away at it, as you can see. There's my WordPress.com website. There's the Patreon link, although they're slow on the uptake on getting money to me. And so for the really fancy Swifties who really feel that I can use a little extra scratch, and I can, there's the GoFundMe thing. And so there's the shameless plug in the middle of the show. Now I want to hear Shannon's next excerpt.
That's right. Reading Replacing Darwin with RJ and Jackson. I'm so excited. I'm big fans of both of you guys. So I'm pretty pumped to be here right now. I was like, Paul, get them to let me join them. Okay, so they're talking about marsupials just as a preamble to this. So they talk about marsupials and how they're indigenous to Australia. That's the preamble to this.
Does he also mention the ones in South America?
I can't even.
Okay, all right. I'll wait for it.
So, like
Fire
so many
your
other
gun.
species, they're indigenous, i.e., native to one continent and nowhere else. This is marsupials. Just saying. In scientific, no, just mute yourself, Jackson, and scream. I know, I get it. Okay, and nowhere else. In scientific terms, we refer to them as endemic, native to one place and only one place. Why don't they exist elsewhere? The species patterns on islands reveal an intriguing clue to this enigma. For example, today in Hawaii, 9 species of mammals are indigenous. 6 of the species are whales or dolphins. The Hawaiian monk seal, the North American river otter, and bat constitute the final 3. No terrestrial mammals are indigenous to Hawaii. Even though the Hawaiian Islands represent a small land area, total land mass is not the explanation for the absence of land mammals. Rhode Island, for example, is 6 times smaller than the Hawaiian Islands, yet this tiny northeastern state has 20 native species of mammals. Besides bats and otters, Rhode Island possesses over 10 species of rodents, several species of rabbits, and species of deer and bobcats. Since Hawaii is surrounded by the Pacific Ocean for thousands of miles, only creatures that could cross the ocean exist there. Why even make the reference to Rhode? Like, I don't understand it. Like,
Yeah, because last time I looked, Rhode Island ain't an island. So
Also, so one of those 20 mammals is not the Virginia possum. It's not Didelphis virginianus. That's not one of the 20 mammals.
well, apparently there's 10 species of rodents, 20 native species of mammals, and besides bats and otters, there's only the rest of them are rodents. There's just bats, otters, and rodents. That's all there is in Rhode Island. I'm sorry, Jackson, you're wrong. He's a PhD from Harvard.
With the biogeography issue, because in order for every animal that's on islands is never something that couldn't get there naturally. And if he's got a young Earth creationist context where the universe is only 12,000 years old or less, then he's got to have all of that biogeographical diversity accounted for in his model. Do I kind of get the sneaking suspicion that he never explained why the biota of Hawaii or anywhere else was the way it was?
Why didn't he reference the Galapagos?
I don't know. You'd love his theory on zebra stripes too. It's pretty good.
Oh, I'm sure they were, because of the fall and lions are going to eat them or whatever.
Well, no, because their stripes fit the grassland environments of Africa, zebras likely migrated across the Sahara, and thrived there. So zebras came across the Sahara so that they could get to the grasslands because that's where they were made to be.
Does he ever have like
you're saying they already had their stripes and then they went to the grassland? Okay.
To be precise, there were 3 different chance migrations. To be precise, 3 different chance migrations would be required. Today, not 1, but 3 species of zebra roam sub-Saharan Africa. The plain zebra.
Did you say when this happened?
All 3 species possess characteristic features. For example, plain zebra, blah, 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 blah. Thus, they all had to migrate at a similar time.
Also,
and he doesn't tell us when that was.
Does he make note of why Afrotherians are all closely related genetically and all live in Africa?
No, Jackson, he doesn't answer questions that might contradict his theory. He only poses questions that will affirm.
It's almost like he's leaving data out of his argument there,
Yeah, no, those zebras this is how the zebras migrated from Mount Ararat, by the way. That's why. In
Hawaii,
3 separate migrations, because they had 3 separate stripe patterns. And they went to the grass because that's where they needed to be because they have stripes. And they'd fit best there.
There we go. God intended. So he made sure that the stuff they needed was matched their stripes, and then they all galloped off from the ark afterwards. So I'm assuming, does he ever bring up the flood at all? Does he even have it in an index?
He does. He does. He brings up. Yeah. He
Oh,
does.
I want to hear that part. I'll point out while you're looking that up.
Talk amongst yourself. I'll try to find some of the references.
Like 400 species of fruit fly, if memory serves me, are endemic to Hawaii. That's something like 70% of all the world's fruit flies species are in Hawaii. And so we can presume that the fruit fly made it there and there was no competition. And boy, did they have fun.
Oh, God.
I don't know how you made it. I would not have made it.
I have oh God, I have so many. You want to hear about the flood? This portion transitions into astrophysics.
Ooh,
my favorite transition.
Transitions to astrophysics.
Cosmology. Okay, let's hear this one.
Oh God, this one's a little bit longer, so I'm sorry. Okay, so the flood of Noah about 4,500 years ago, in theory, this worldwide flood would dramatically alter global rates of geological change. At a minimum, these creationists would argue that the rates at the flood were very different from the rates we can measure today. These YEC geologists have developed testable scientific models that have documented phenomena in the field that are consistent with their ideas. For example, they've made and experimentally tested hypotheses, on accelerated rates of radioactive decay, accelerated rates of plate tectonic movement, and accelerated rates of geological deposition and erosion. The astronomers of the YEC community have followed suit in their own fields of study. They have successfully predicted the magnetic fields for our planets and our own solar system. They have revisited astronomical data in light of Einstein's general relativity, specifically with respect to the latter. YEC astronomers have uncovered the directionality limits of the speed of light I cited above because of Einstein's discoveries, the measured speed of light represents a round trip speed. Measurements of light in a single direction are physically impossible without circular assumptions. Since our view of the universe is illuminated by the travel of light in one direction, from distant stars and galaxies to our telescope, the great size of the universe is not a sound argument for an ancient universe.
Now, what sources
From
did he offer?
flood
for
to
that?
astrophysics,
Yeah.
how the how?
Did he have any footnotes
How?
for that little puppy?
He did, yeah. Without circular assumptions is the only one that has a footnote. Do you want to see what that footnote is?
Oh, yeah.
Footnote
Tell us
40. Footnote 40, article by Answers in Genesis.
There we go.
Sounds about right.
J.G. Hartnett, A Biblical Creationist Cosmology, Answers Research Journal, 2015, available online at Answers Research Journal.
Well, I'm almost surprised he didn't cite Jason Lyle for that one.
Well, I imagine
Everything
the Answers in
about this-
Genesis one does. That because that's basically what it means. But what if you translate from Chinese into English, what he's actually saying is that a bunch of young Earth creationists want to make geological and astrophysical arguments that fit their model, and they suggest stuff, and then they ignore most of the data to arrive at their conclusions and don't actually test it out, because that plate tectonic, that super fast plate tectonics. Yeah, I've seen the stuff that Woodmore does a little bit of this, and Barnes and Todd Wood and a few other Kurt Wise. They all make claims, but they don't actually, air quotes, test it out against the physical details of things, because they've never been able to come up with a plausible structure of what the pre-flood world was like. They've now, I loved when I saw at the Creation Museum that they use, I didn't physically visit, but I saw it in a clip, that they've decided that the pre-flood world is the Rodinia supercontinent, which according to standard geology is Precambrian, back in the Ediacara biota era. And then the post-flood goes through a temporary stage when it looks like Pangea, and then very uber quickly into the version that we now see. So we have to go in the space of a few years from a Rodinia supercontinent into Pangea and then to the existing continental layout.
Yeah, it's The whole book, I've been commiserating all alone, so I'm just so glad to have people.
Well, we are happy
with Paul.
for you to have a
I've been just messaging Paul going, I need you to read this because
it's shit.
Tell me that I'm reading this right. Oh, God.
Yeah, and from his frame, he's riffing off of areas that he knows diddly squat about. He's simply relying on the authority of the unnamed and unreferenced people that are filtering through answers in Genesis, and the game goes both ways. So you have people that then are going to be relying in the cosmology argument or geology or others, and they'll say, well, our friend Jeanson has done this absolutely magnificent work in his book establishing the genetics of recent speciation. No, he didn't.
Yeah, that's the problem. If you go through the footnotes, 99% of the footnotes, and there are so many, it's by volume, well cited. By volume, it's well cited. But it's either him or Answers Research Journal. Periodically, it's a biologo scientist, which fine. I have more respect for them. Or it's a quote mine, from what I can gather. Yeah. And the whole what really bothers me about this book in particular is that it's being marketed to adolescents as a science book. That's the entire marketing strategy of this book.
Well, a lot of you have to, if it's being marketed to adolescents, you have to understand the vast majority of them are not going to fact check it. They're just going to see it, love it, and then spread it elsewhere. Disseminate it to all the four corners.
Recommend it to the poor heathen atheist evolutionists who cannot see the reality of it. Right. Stephen Bauman points out a thing about the supercontinents. You're quite right. There were previous ones there. They've got Kennerland, Nuna, Columbia, possibly Ur. What you got? Obviously, the farther you go back into time, the harder it is to reconstruct stuff. So what we have are fragmentary bits and pieces that, because of the way that deposits are laid down, that you indicate that there's probably a part of a larger supercontinent structure. It looks like supercontinent cycles run about 600 million years or so. And so we're about midway through a branch, and there will probably be a new supercontinent form. And they have big effects on climate potentially, because there's a difference between a supercontinent that forms in one hemisphere, northern versus southern, or vertically, the way Pangaea was constructed, where it ran pole to pole, basically. But the Rodinia supercontinent was more clustered in the southern hemisphere and had a big pile of water to the north. And because of the way that oceans and currents and all that run, that has a huge effect on things. It didn't have much effect on complex life, because during those earlier supercontinents, there was nothing above water. So the only one that actually has affected stuff where critters run around on land and can affect ecosystems that way is the Pangaea supercontinent. But their future ones will deal with that. Anyway, that's just an interjection to resolve that point. Yeah, I commiserate on your plow through that, but in its own way, it's immensely educational, because by looking up what people claim on their side, you can look at their heavy guns. Jeanson is a geneticist. He is being preened as a matter of an authority figure. He's not some Kent Hovind, Ken Ham doofus who's just operating at the lower echelon. He has a FUD, so he gets to be an authority figure. And so going after that level is really very useful, because when you see that there's no there, that there's no man behind the curtain, even at that level, that's an important thing to observe.
Like, it frustrates me. Everything about Answers in Genesis frustrates me. The fact that they get PhDs to compile this garbage.
Oh, well, I think part of it's really funny.
Authority.
I think part of it's kind of funny, because you look at people like Georgia and Jeanson, and they are geneticists, yes, but they are running from their own fields when it comes to phylogenetics. They will not touch the genetic relationships among different organisms, because they know, because they had to go to university and they had to learn about this crap, that these guys are related, and we can show that they're related. And so when Georgia writes a paper on baraminology, like determining arc kinds or something like that, they look at the morphology only, and they're just like, hey, they look kind of different, so they must be different.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so it all
exactly.
becomes a game of what data is being left out. So that's why the omissions in these argument frames are so relevant. Like when he's skirting past endosymbiosis and the huge amount of technical literature that relate to that, the biogeography issue, how he's tiptoeing back that ever so gently. He's bringing up critters that are going to be commonplace animals, and by relying a lot on genetic information, by definition, you're dealing with living animals. So
Right.
he's immediately removing himself from stuff. The problem too about his difficulties with the fossil record, I pointed out in Slam Dunk, is that animals aren't made magically. That if you have a bone in a particular state, there shall have been genes to do it. And so you can now start investigating. In one case, they were able to retro-engineer the appearance of these little bone struts that are occurring in the vertebrae. And they've literally identified the gene that will turn them on and off. And so you are effectively predicting retroactively what the genetic structure is of an extinct organism in order to arrive at the morphology that you can see.
Which is what they accuse other people of doing. Were you there? Were you there?
Yeah,
Were you
there?
there? Were you there? You didn't
Were you
see.
there?
You don't know. You can't reconstruct from the fossil record, but they assume.
Well, they also use artistic renditions of these prehistoric animals taken lovingly from paleontologists and paleo artists who actually understand evolution.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
a lot of parasitism.
They benefit from evolution.
Henry David Thoreau's old line that some circumstantial evidence is conclusive, like finding a trout in the milk. And that's what we can find.
Was that the night the night Thoreau spent in jail?
Yeah, it could well be. Thoreau was it's fun to know that the people that were involved in the Romantic movement and the new poets of the 1820s and 30s and 40s were really heavy science groupies. And Goethe and others, these are all people who adored science as well as their writing material. And so they were always keeping up with the latest stuff. Even Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, she's circulating in an environment where she's kind of paying attention to all this stuff that's going to turn into the biogenesis debate in another couple of generations. And so there are a lot of ones that have that area. I'd like to see more people have a clear embrace of all the different disciplines and not try to see the sciences as something that's over in that corner, or worse, disciplinary science is separated. Well, I don't need to know anything about paleontology because I'm a geneticist, or I don't need to know anything about ecological systems because I'm in climate science. No, all of these things start connecting up. And when you have to work out stuff about biogeographical relationships and paleoclimates to discover why animals are where they are because of the fact that the monsoons are coming in on the mountain range that you can reconstruct because you've worked out the plate tectonics. And so now you know why that particular habitat existed at that time 200 million years ago. All of this stuff is boldly interdisciplinary. Whereas with Jeanson's book and Jeanson's creationism, everything is separate and not equal and disconnected. So he's not trying to link up information really seriously to find out, even on a subject that he brings up like foxes or anything else, to where he would be honestly trying to present a working hypothesis of what the paleoclimate was during the flood years and really come through with it. But you can't. It's never going to work, because you're always going to be stumbling on a huge block of data. So Jackson, who's looked at some of the baraminology stuff as well, knows that in order to work out created kinds, they've got to leave out most of the data field. In order to do biogeography, they've got to leave out most of the data field. In order to do paleo, every field that you look at, they're leaving stuff out on a colossal scale.
The thing you were saying shortly about how interdisciplinary it is. If you look at papers like I just posted in the chat on deep homology and the origins of evolutionary novelty, which is Neil Shubin, Cliff Tabin, and Sean Carroll.
Yeah, marvelous stuff.
They are crossing genetics with the fossil record.
Yeah,
and Evo Devo, which is precisely what Evo Devo is. Looking at, or that's what a lot of it is comparing what we know about the genetics with what we know about the fossils.
Link doesn't work. Sometimes there will be screw ups on that, depending on your browser and a lot of other stuff. So if you look, you should be able to find origin. You can Google it, origin of evolutionary novelties, or look up Neil Shubin's websites or any of that kind of stuff. You can hunt around for it. There's a task for you. But the wonderful thing about I try to give the people an impression to carry around their own map of time in their own heads, to recognize that if you imagine in the room you're in, that one wall is everything that's alive now, and everything crossing the room is the past, going back to the beginning of life. And when you look at the stuff now, it's an enormously rich ecosystem of interconnecting ecologies and organisms and predator-prey relationships and microbiota and little critters living inside your eyelashes, and just a fantastic nexus of stuff. And that same level of complexity would have been occurring in the past too. But all you're getting are the tiny little slices of it represented by a fossil here, or an isotope ratio here or there, or something like that. And what the modern scientists are attempting to do is to get a closer and closer impression of the enormous range and diversity and intricacy of those past lives based upon the forensic clues that we have. So it's exactly like a detective story. And it's better than any detective story because it's really true. Because you're not looking at some hypothetical murder mystery, you're looking at what actually existed in the past. And what Shannon has already discovered in Jeanson's book is, yeah, he brings up subjects and he names names and he mentions kind of sort of stuff. But all you have to do is to step back a step or two and realize, no, he's not discussing the subject. He's not bringing in the whole data field. He's not conceptualizing his own position or fairly representing the position of the opposition. Instead, it's just a kind of little picky. It's like you're making, your goal is to make a huge jigsaw puzzle. And instead,
don't say jigsaw puzzle. Oh, God.
I know, because he uses the jigsaw analogy. It's like he's trying to make a jigsaw puzzle where he's taken the fact area, tossed out 90% of the data, and then trimmed off 5 or 6 pieces until they can form together to make his little itty bitty puzzle, which is his young Earth creationist model. I don't have to guess on that 90%. I would wager that if Shannon went through his reference bibliography, and you can easily do it in any format. This is what I've done with all the books and stuff that I do now in terms of full data field, is you mark down, try to find the ones that are actually referencing external science data, not AIG websites, not secondary accounts or something, but actual technical papers. And however many notes he has in there as cited material, or if he has a bibliography, that too can be used as the measuring tool. Find out how much of that actually is technical science literature, and that will give you one heuristic measurement. Even if you've got somebody like Michael Denton, who is just a pile of technical literature, but he misrepresents it constantly. So as soon as you read the technical literature, that's then the second step, is once you have him citing a technical paper, then you can read the technical paper, and now you can measure how he approaches that data field. And I'll bet you $9 to a hole in a donut, he's leaving stuff out.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think I kind of found a reproductive quote for you guys, too.
Ooh.
A couple of them, actually. If you want to hear one more before,
no,
I'm
absolutely.
not sure.
We got still a few minutes left, and I can tell you from my end as a compulsive scholar, knowing what the other side actually says, even though it makes you want to puke occasionally, is nonetheless instructive.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. So this is from like chapter 1. So third.
Chapter 1.
Yeah. Chapter 1. Third, despite this enormous upheaval in morphology, the outcome of the development process was extremely consistent. Development of sperm and egg faithfully result in the exact same traits from generation to generation. In fact, it results in consistent species-specific traits. It must, or we would have no concept of species in our vocabulary. If each species could spawn something entirely different every generation, species wouldn't even be a scientific term. There's
sort of a half thing to that. And if you look at the whole history,
he's washing over the fact that there's moderate or minor mutations. And that also when you're not producing an exact copy in your offspring.
I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry.
Think of shows enormous variety. when you start looking at the genetic level, and you find that there are haplotypes and variations going on all over the place. Now, whether or not those end up generating a novel species or not will depend upon circumstances, and that is not being designed into it. But the degrees to which, even in the excerpts that I was looking at from Amazon online, how he speaks in generalities, he tends not to illustrate much, or if he does, he's illustrating it often with material that's kind of old. And I noticed in the HOX genes only popped up once, and it was related to like some very basic fruit fly stuff. Well, good gravy, the amount of literature on homeobox genes that's emerged over the last 20 years, just wading into the edges of it, is going to involve a vast amount of information. We know from so many of the species work that's been done on elephants and giraffes and others as to what looked like one species might actually be separate species, now that you're starting to look at it more closely. And what does a speciation event look like? By definition, before it gets to be a speciation event, it's now a variety within a species. And so that kind of detailing, I noticed one of the things that was in a section I couldn't look up because it was in the not in the excerpt thing. But when you do a search on Amazon, it'll and you bring up a topic, it'll bring up all the examples, and some of them are in gray because you can't look at them, and some of them are darker color that you can click on. Well, but he'll still show you the stuff you can't get at. And one of the examples that he came up with for this linear speciation thing related to chipmunks and squirrels. Well, I happen to have attended a fabulous lecture about 4 or so Darwin years ago at the Darwin Day here out at EWU, where they brought in, and I can never remember the goddamn guy, starts with an S. Anyway, it's not Sutherland, it's something else like that. And he is one of the marvelous people on speciation and hybrid speciation issues, and how mitochondria play a role in producing hybridization zones and either prevent or facilitate speciation events in chipmunks and squirrels. His expertise is in the red squirrel or whatever it is that lives up here in the Pacific Northwest, and they can literally tell you a species in the process of fissioning off and why it hasn't fissioned off yet, because it's got this hybridization zone where the mitochondria in the species are fighting the regular nuclear DNA, and they can look at it at the very detailed genetic level and all the things. Now, they all look like chipmunks. But going on underneath is the dynamics of speciation at that genetic level. And there's
they see it in phlox, I think is the genus flowers in Texas. They're like, they're the same species, if I remember correctly, but there are 2 different petal colors, and it has something to do with like bees not cross-pollinating or something like that.
Yeah, and so a lot of those are incipient speciation events that in principle may or may not, and like the ring species example, which several creationists say that they've seized upon the latest bit, where if you define, for those of you who don't know what a ring species is, herring gull is a classic example of where you've got a species A, and then it's species A around a geographical range, and everyone can interbreed with everyone adjacent to it. But when you get to the ends of the ring, the A and the other A won't interbreed. And from a practical point of view, functionally, they're separate species, but they don't realize it because you still have gene flow around through the ring. Well, one specific definition of a ring species is that there can be no geographical branching in any of its subcomponents. And if you do that, then it's not officially a ring species, but it's still a ring species that you've got, that you're just looking at it a little bit farther at another level. And so I've seen creationists online who've been trying to pick up on that and try to lob Jerry Coyne at me and all of that, when, it's a matter of definitionals.
Yeah, he's very anti-ring species, isn't he?
Well, no, all he did, he rightly pointed out that they're talking about a very specific definition of ring. And in that extremely rigid definition, then no, I think finally somebody found a ring species that actually qualified under that. Well, but in the generic term of integrating units around a geographical range, there are a bunch of those, and they do pop up. They just don't usually qualify because there's a tiny thing about whether or not there's been geographical range and variation in the subgroups, that if you don't have that, then that. It's the same way as when people try to nitpick on the definition of mammal.
Well, yeah, but it's also, it'd be very hard I think, to find a perfect series of gradations around some geographic barrier. I mean,
Bingo.
you have multiple examples of ring species, and besides just the Laris gulls and Insatina salamanders, you have the Caribbean slipper spurs, greenest warblers. You have just so many of them.
And when you look at the ones in which you have a ring, if one of them happened to have graded off and have some geographical distribution issues, that now means it's not an official ring species. It's still got all the trademarks of that genetic flow around a geographical range for that whole cluster. And so that's why that it depends on who you ask about it. You get into a lot of definitional games, and it's one thing that I always like to avoid when you have people that are lobbing stuff at each other at a technical level, and they don't realize how creationists are going to be using these little in-house debates over terminology. That was what happened with Colin Patterson. You know the chapter I did on that in Slam Dunk. And book plug, everybody should get Evolution Slam Dunk so that you can know what the hell I'm talking about here. You can get it from Amazon, or you can get it on your Kindle or your book reader, your Nook reader, any of those. It's available in electronic formats too. I'm in that ebook level too. I for one like physical books. I find it awkward when I did both the novel and Slam Dunk. I had to physically get the proof copy sent to me because I can't really proofread efficiently with a PDF. Because even on a big computer screen, you just lose a grip on things, and the ability to jump back and forth from one section of the book easily to another is something you can do in a physical book. So I'm old school.
I'm a Kindle girl. Do you guys want to hear why the second law of thermodynamics makes it impossible for things to evolve?
Oh, did he put that one in?
What? Ooh,
I have so many treats for you. There's not enough time.
I thought that was on the Answers in Genesis no-go list. No.
Well, maybe he doesn't read Answers in Genesis. Yeah, that's one of those, they just can't give it up. And it's not even necessarily a diagnostic of young Earth creationism anymore, because you've got, boy, the frozen picture that I got up here at the moment is pretty scary. Granville Sewell over in Intelligent Design Land. We're running a little over the hour, but who cares? Granville Sewell in Intelligent Design Land has tried to pick up this thermodynamic argument. And it's one of the stupidest things in all of anti-evolutionism. So, of course, Granville Sewell picks it up. And it's one of these jujitsu attempts to try to slam dunk things based upon a hypothetical. The problem is that unless you're arguing that organisms in reproducing are somehow violating thermodynamics, because that's what you need for evolution, or that natural variation can't occur because of thermodynamics, if you allow that, you've got Darwinian evolution. So the thermodynamic argument about how life originated or any of these other kinds of things are utterly irrelevant and just twaddle.
But
the fact that he was trotting it out means that he really still loves it. He wants it to be true.
All right. So here's the thermodynamics reason, the second law of thermodynamics reason that there's kinds. There's another example. No two zebra individuals are alike. Again, zebra parents and zebra offspring are both members of the same species, but none of the three are identical. A little bit of change happens each generation, but is the accumulation of these little changes over time enough to produce a new species? The solution for this paradox holds the key for discovering the origin of traits, the edge to the pieces of the puzzle, and the origin of the species. Prior to the discovery of the DNA double helix, candidate solutions to these paradoxes began to emerge. One candidate arose in the fields of physics and chemistry. For example, consider the physics of transforming just a single cell into a complex adult. This single cell would have to overcome many chemical and physical barriers in order to produce an adult. In other words, left to themselves, physical structures don't spontaneously assemble into creatures with heads and tails. Instead, thanks to the second law of thermodynamics, they degrade, which, like an old library, collects dust and eventually collapses without maintenance. To make a trunk or a long neck or a wing, cells would have to find a way to put energy into the system to overcome this intense thermodynamic barrier.
Poor Jackson is.
Did he die? Did Jackson die? Jackson, are you okay? Someone
And
died on one. Jackson just died.
for somebody to write that in 2017 is like him expounding on phlogiston. I mean, it's just absolute gibberish. That when you look at how the genetic systems are playing out in gastrulation, and then the homeobox genes start kicking in to develop dorsal and ventral and all of that stuff, that all it needs is an input of energy. Obviously, if a cell starves to death, it won't make a trunk.
I thought that would be a good mic drop.
Energy inputting, the cell's gonna do that no matter what. And it isn't like it's just flailing around like, oh my, if thermodynamics, I don't know how I'm going to make my trunk. Holy moly.
Well, it can't.
This is medieval thinking.
It takes a lot of energy to make a trunk, RJ. You don't get how thermodynamics work, and I don't know what your problem is.
Yeah, indeed. There we go. We got to have all that pumping that energy into it, like in food and the stuff. Yeah, that'll do it.
You can't just turn a cow into an elephant, like, without Jesus. God.
And even so, you'll notice this still evades the issue of kinds. And for one thing, there would be nothing for him to steal.
Well, he's the elephant kind. RJ, you're not listening. God damn it, RJ. It's an elephant kind.
Yes, I know. It's one of those. Yeah. Well, I want to know how Gomphomers fit into that little equation. The fun thing is that I keep on asking people when I bump into creationists, because this doesn't apply to intelligent designers. They don't do systematics. Older creationists don't do systematics. They literally, it's just not in their brain. They could care less. So they don't deal with kinds. They just are complaining about microrevolution, and that's about all it goes to. But creationists have got to have kinds. And the reason is because the stall plan on Noah's Ark is not unlimited. They have got to narrow it down enough so that they can have the number of kinds aboard the ark, and then have to figure out how to take those kinds and wiggly woggly them to be the diversity that we see today. And maybe, if they're really generous, account for the fossil record that we can see in all this supposed hydrologic sorting that's taking place during the big slosh.
Sorting. Oh, God.
So you have got a series of hurdles that are implicit in the concept of kind that doesn't apply to intelligent design people. So the obvious question is, well, how many kinds are there? And at which point you get the deer in the headlight, because there is literally no list anywhere of created kinds. And Jackson, you know from the phylogenetic stuff that you've been looking at, and you probably bumped into this as well, Shannon, is that when you look in the paleontology listings or books on morphology and the different phyla, you have these long appendices where there are lists of the number of classes and the list of the number of families and lists of the genera and the list of the species within genera, and you can just be overwhelmed with the systematic detail of what they pin down, and you could actually come up with numbers and groups and details. Move over to creationism land, and it's a fog. There are maybe 1,500 kinds, dog, or 8,500, or something else. And they're always, like, if you ask a 5-year-old
what all the different kinds of animals are, that's what kinds are. If you say, hey, little Davy, what are all the animals? And they say cat, dog, bird, cow.
And literally, creationists do exactly the same thing. Even he, in his own book, from what I could see for the examples he was bringing up, are relatively familiar groups. No fossil dative ones. They're always living. And so by limiting himself to the living, he doesn't have to worry about transitional therapsids and traditional birds and traditional myocids and traditional Tiktaalex and traditional this and traditional that. And another of the dogs not barking in the night inside of his brain. Where are they now? Where are the tyrannosaurs? Where are the dimetrodons? Where are all these creatures that were supposedly preserved on Noah's Ark in order to preserve life? And then by some mysterious circumstance, this luck of the draw, that every single damned animal that's thought to have gone extinct a long time ago turns out to have gone extinct since the flood. And other than
dinosaurs is an easy one, because humans hunted them to death, and that's where dragon legends came from.
Oh, yeah. That's where creationism intersects cryptozoology. And that's one of the funniest little intersections, because you've got these wacko people looking around for dinosaurs down in Africa. And the
Jackson, you know
creationists
a lot about everything.
they have to link up with them because that's their only hope. Yeah, the cryptozoology thing is the only space around that can give some hope to the idea that somewhere there's a Loch Ness monster, somewhere there's an ancient Dimetrodon, somewhere there's some fire-breathing Parasaurolophus, and that maybe that they can track some of these things down or find some cockamamie legend somebody had to make it real. And so Dwayne Gish was talking about hunters seeing pteranodons in the Southwest in the 19th century and all of the, I mean, it's just terrible crap, but that's what they got to do. Meanwhile, there's all that real science out there that you and I know about that's invisible. They don't pay any attention to it, and we're supposed to be impressed with that.
I think part of the problem is ultimately, like, their air quotes science is all publicly available to anybody who wants to see it. One of the problems that sourcers like myself come across is that a lot of the legitimate science is hidden behind a paywall.
Hey, go, you know, pay to go to a university, and then, hey, you've got access to a
right.
Although
I definitely did. I went to university and I had access to a whole database and library.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it?
It was great, but unfortunately, I don't have it now. I don't have it now. So when people ask me about science, I go and I look, and luckily for me, my best friend is a PhD who works at a university, so I can reach out to her and be like, hey, can you help me look at this article or pull out this excerpt? No, I don't know what ResearchGate is, Jack. So you're going to have to tell me that, because I do so much sourcing.
Yeah, ResearchGate at Academia EDU. I was about to point out, I am an impoverished writer who is underfunded, so I can't afford to buy articles. So I am desperately, viscerally aware of how much is available without having to pay for it.
Right.
To get that
PDF.
Now, I'm
a single mom, so I'm with you.
Almost all of the biological-based evolution material is freebie, at least after a year. So anything at PNAS or genetics or even now evolution, you'll find the vast majority of their material is freebie. The stuff that's the harder to get are the geology material and some of the cosmology stuff. But
psychology and neurology is some of the stuff that I need.
Yeah, some of that is hard to get to. But hunt around. And then one of the tools that I use is Google the title of the article.
I've done that. Yes, I have. And I have that little unlock thing.
Yeah, exactly. To where, and I even do pass-throughs of where, when I'm plugging material into my spreadsheet, for older material, and I see some little spot down the road where I got a little gray box or a white box, which means that I don't have anything beyond an abstract or nothing at all, that it's older material. I go, oh, okay, I'm looking at that in my spreadsheet because it's 50,000 sources, so you can't see all of it at once. And I'm going, gee, I wonder if I can find that now. So I'll redo and look through again and find out whether somebody has put it on Academia EDU, somebody has posted it, it's being used in a college course, so they put it in as part of their syllabus, and so the college has that, or the professor does it at their own website. And those are the way you end run around. I will tell you that I can get around 80 to 85% of the technical papers that I need free somewhere.
Wow.
So
that's awesome.
It's very easy to do. It's enormous. Yeah. So absolutely nobody has an excuse for not being able to find a lot of primary source material. You may not be able to find everything, but you're going to be able to find a
large body of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I guess
so we have got an armament at our disposal that doesn't require money. It only requires diligence and effort and interconnectivity in social media to make available this stuff. And then, of course, occasionally we have things like Jackson, where he's got access to some of this stuff from a college level, or university people. When I was doing my older material, and also for the Slam Dunk book, there was a particular paper I needed, the Allen paper, which I demonstrated that Gish misrepresented that source. I needed to see that paper to do that.
Right.
I got it free because I had a connection there with Professor Lowe at the Carnegie, and he sent me stuff before, and I said, do you happen to have this? And he goes, sure, boop, and shoots it out to me. So those are other mechanisms that you can use to be able to build up your ammunition case. And can you imagine if you have a network, and I'll do the plug for the Science Strike Force Network again. Can you imagine thousands of people all around the country, all grassroots activists who have a love of method and a love of the science and all of that. And some of you will have read Jeanson when I haven't. and some of the I'll have read stuff that you haven't, and we can compare notes like this and connect up in this way.
Yeah.
And that means we all become better armed. And so in our local networks, whenever anti-evolutionists are coming up, either on social media or physically in person, we can now have a better game to be able to combat them. There's no excuse.
And I think we're building a pretty good network of people too, which is fantastic.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
there's the connections. I've gone from Jackson had to disappear there. He may be popping back in after a bit. He might have been struck by lightning down there in
I know he had to run away.
The connections. So that thing's I am amazed. I'm an old fart. And let me remind you how much the world has changed since I was a young fart. That the idea that I would be sitting here in the 21st century with a portable computer that has more memory than the entire computers on Earth when I was born, that I can have instantaneous communication with people everywhere on the planet, that I can gain access to not only technical articles, but often whole books available free as full hundreds of pages of PDF that you can download in a matter of seconds. That this is an amazing world that we live in. There are going to be stupid people out there who are like starving to death. Have you ever seen Annie Mayne, the old movie, where she says, life is a banquet and most poor suckers are starving to death? Well, on the sciences, it's exactly the same situation, where we live in a golden world of information access, not only in the science department, but history and archaeology and paleontology and the arts and all this stuff that is accessible on a scale that's just miraculous. Never for a moment realize what it is. You see behind me my record collection, my CDs, back in the days when people were getting CDs. Who but a king could listen to this music in the way that I do? When would somebody of a working class background like me have been able to hear a Mahler symphony if I were born in 1910? Whereas I can literally pull it out, put it on my CD player, and have the command of a symphony orchestra instantaneously that way. And live streamers can do the same sort of a thing. Never for a moment underestimate how absolutely astonishing that is. It's incredible. And let's make the most of it. Nobody has an excuse to be stupid anymore. If they do it, it's because they have bad method. And it's our job to show that bad method right in front of everybody. And they probably won't change because they're Tortukans. But somebody out there maybe have the light bulb go off and go, these guys have got it on the ball. These gals have got it on the ball. These people have this access to this cornucopia of knowledge. And I want to join that parade. That's what I'm hoping to do here in the Evolution Hours and in all the stuff that I've been doing, because it's not only true, it's fun.
I agree. I think my larger point was more so that a lot of people look for reaffirmation. They don't necessarily look for what's accurate or what's true. They look for reaffirmation. And where we live in a society in an age where digital information is so readily available, it's easy to find something that's reaffirming. And in the instances where somebody's looking for research that reaffirms young Earth creationism, it's much easier to find information that's readily available and easy to find without having to jump through the hoops and figure out a way around the system to just find something that reaffirms that it is to find something that contradicts. So I like it's great that you're doing what you're doing and that, you know, Paul's doing what he's doing and Jackson's doing what he's doing to show people source methodology and to demonstrate and do that research for people and make it more so palatable and in a consumable package, so that it's not, because a lot of people, if it's difficult, they just won't even bother. That doesn't mean that they're not willing to change their minds. It just means that they're not willing to put the effort in that it would take to do so because they're not invested. And I think that's one of the points that I was initially trying to make. Not that it's not accessible to people. It's just that once it becomes difficult, you hit that wall and you stop searching because
there's another example where my old fartism can be helpful and illustrative. Is I had a background in history. I don't have a PhD in paleontology. I'm not a geneticist. I'm not any of those things.
Right.
But don't for a moment be intimidated by anything that's jargon and technical. In principle, everything can be understood. And one of the things I have layers of analysis. you can easily judge a measure of anything. If you're talking about some technical issue, say a genetics paper, and you download a technical paper and it looks like Martian to you, that's a clue of what you need to understand. So then you start figuring out, well, what's the stuff I do? Is there anything in it? Oh, I understand that point, but this other thing I just am clueless on. That's where you can Google material. And what I always look around for in any discipline that I'm just coming into is a useful survey article, which is written. Often you'll find this in annual reviews of fill in the blank, where you'll have technical people that are writing there. It's for a technical audience, but it's not a super technical thing. It's designed to explain it in a more general context so people can get a grip on what the cutting edge is. And even at a lower level, articles in National Geographic or Scientific American function in that same path of being summaries of things that will be like door openers. What you want to do is to find areas that you naturally love, that you're interested in. With me, it was dinosaurs. I was always, no wild horse is going to keep me from looking at dinosaur stuff, independent of creationism. And so that was a way that I started reading the paleontology stuff. David Norman's Dinosaur Encyclopedia that I got in the 1980s. It's been superseded by a lot of more recent research on some areas, but it's still gobsmackingly good. And he was a wonderful explainer of things. And so even though you'll know that we now have a different understanding of how many different lineages of Carnosaur there were, that wasn't the case in the 1980s, he's showing you how paleontology thinks, how they approach data fields, why they're talking. They would talk about each little subgroup and show the chronological range of them and the geographical range of them and show you illustrations of them. And slowly you start building up a thing, and you would see the bones of the animals that they would have. And so you would start familiarizing yourself. And then the dawning moment would go off when you go, oh, I see why that's an ancestor of the ceratopsids. That's got that predentary bone, that little parrot beak in the front that's very distinctive. And bit by bit, you start generating the diagnostic bits. Everybody does this in some area. Baseball groupies can go rattling on about the scores, and they can see a good pitcher versus a bad pitcher, and they can know the stats of people off the bat. Opera groupies can identify the singer just in a matter of seconds, and they can hum along with it. People who are gardeners can identify the particular flowers and plants, and they know which soils are good. Everybody is doing that level of science and that level of analysis in some ways. The point is for people to realize, though, there's one method, is you want to pay attention to all the data. You want to understand what's really true. You need to have standards to figure out what is true. And you fairly go into the data and look for it. You don't simply look for confirmation bias like you would, whether it's taking Jerry Coyne's stuff at face value or answers in Genesis. You measure them. You test them.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I really wish that people would be given an education on how to discern information better and how to understand source methodology, or research methodology, I should say, and how to better, like most people when they're looking through articles, for example, will look essentially just at the abstract and the conclusion, and they won't really take a deep dive into the methodology. Is where I live. When I'm reading an article, I'll look at the abstract to find out if it's interesting. But the first place I go to, I essentially just skip over the introduction and I go right to the materials and methodology, and I look at the tables. That's what I want to see. I want to see how this research was conducted. What type of statistical analysis did you use? Did you have the appropriate controls? Those are the types of things that I want to see right from go. Before I read anything else, I want to see is your methodology sound. That's what's important. And most people don't. They just say it. This is science. I read a science thing that said science stuff. Thus, I scienced, and now I'm smart.
And I came at this from a different direction because I was taught historical method. Which is never confuse a primary and a secondary source.
Right.
Ideally, all your argument wants to be grounded in primary source material. So always be aware of when somebody is dealing with the secondary stuff. And when you're talking about like, Gibbon's Fall of the Roman Empire, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, it's a brilliant secondary source. It's an analysis. And so I learned probably more about sound method in my historiography course, which is the history of history, to show how histories have changed over time and why they changed and what they dealt with. than I did in the science courses that I took. And then I started applying that same method and realizing that when I was looking at creationists, they didn't know the difference between a primary and a secondary source. And some of them, even when you ask them, they'll say, what's a secondary source? What you've been throwing at me.
Exactly.
But they literally won't realize that an Answers in Genesis thing or a Jerry Coyne post is not a primary source. It may be accurate, it may be inaccurate. You only determine that by looking at the material. And a wonderful example came up that I discovered when I was able to look at the primary source material for Slam Dunk. As I began to work on it and to desperately get enough to do a program to get some revenue going, I knew I was going to be covering this because nobody else had covered it. But just as I was starting work on it, I discovered that Michael Denton's new book came out. And I bet you $9 to a hole in a donut that he was going to discuss the reptile-mammal transition. So I actually brought this up with Glenn Branch at the NCSE, and he said, well, we'll get it for you. We'll buy it for you, ship it to you. Then you, when you're done with it, ship it back here. So that'll go into our library. So we'll be ahead of the game on that. And so that's what we did. And so I was able to look at the book in detail before I ferried it off to them. And so I was able to access all of the sources. One of the things he brought up when he finally got around to the reptile-mammal transition, he cited only one paper for it. And that was a paper that wasn't on the reptile-mammal transition. He was trying to argue that the little teeny articular quadrate bone shift, where the dentary bone begins to take over the entire skull, that can't be accounted for by this little itty bitty articular quadrate because it can't generate big bite forces. So he cited a technical paper on the bite force of tyrannosaurs and crocodiles, and showing that these little itty bitty things couldn't possibly do that, and therefore there was not even an imaginable Darwinian scenario to account for why this jaw shift had taken place. Okay. Well, if you looked at just the abstract, you would see right off the bat in the science paper that, well, they're on diapsids, and the reptile mammal transition is synapsids. They have one skull hole that becomes our zygomatic arch, the cheekbone, and not double skull openings like on the archosaurs. And so there's a different skull layout and structure. So this was a bad example to deal with. Another was the false assumption that he was having that it was not the dentary bone that was driving the change, but the little itty bitty articular quadrate. Why was it even involved? But it got worse than that when I got the chance to read the original article, because I found on Academia EDU, someone had downloaded the damn thing. So I could download it for free, this recent article from, I think it was like 2013, something like that, that you would have had to have a paywall, or I could have theoretically gone down to the public library because they carry science and all that. And I could have checked it out and made a copy of it that way, but I got it free. Bingo. It turns out in the article was a chart, and the poor Denton apparently never bothered to read the details of the article, because the chart graphed all of the samples they were talking about as to bite force. And there was a line that went straight up on a straight line, and it was human beings were at the bottom, and there was crocodiles farther up, and then there were tyrannosaurs up at the top. And those animals, even though diapsids and synapsids were lumped together, there was a basic linearity that the bigger the jaw, the bigger the bite force. So tyrannosaurs don't really have a strong bite force for their size. They just got a really big jaw. But on the same chart down in the corner was a blob that wasn't on the line, and a little footnote, M, next to it. And it says, conspicuously not following the bite force rule are insectivores. And he cited a technical paper on that. And they discussed it briefly in the text that insectivores that eat bugs don't have strong bite forces for their size. And the technical paper was listed. So I looked the technical paper up, and it opened a doorway where it turns out that the shape of the dentary bone determines its adaptive features relative to insectivores. And why did insectivores scream in my brain like Hercule Poirot and the clues in the room? Because the early mammals were insectivores. The ones that were going through this transition were insectivores. And it turns out that if you think about, ironically, the information had literally been staring me in the face for decades, but I never noticed it because nobody ever mentioned it, because it just didn't come up in conversation. And that was the shape of the dentary bone. Everybody that did these things would always have the side view, but in some of the things, they would occasionally look down on them, the dorsal. And what you end up with is you see this immensely narrow dentary bone, unlike probanognaathids and stuff, where the dentary bone comes down in this little teeny narrow pipette, and then there's this big bulge where the skull is. For their skull size, they have a ridiculously narrow dentary bone. Why? because the act of eating a bug pulls the bug into the mouth without any bite force strength at all. The curved teeth do it on a long, and the longer the bone is, the narrower the bone is, the easier it is to do that. It was adaptive. So not only could somebody imagine an adaptive Darwinian scenario for the jaw shift, they had done it decades ago, and they'd even performed bite force analyses on probenignathidus, which are the predicted double jaw forms, to show how their dynamics work. So the very thing that he was insisting, Denton was insisting, was nobody had done, had already been done. And I found out about it by reading the source he gave me.
Perfect.
What's wrong with this?
Yeah, exactly.
So that means that you can find out so much available material, and it's almost a truism. I found this out with Duane Gish, the creationist, when I was looking at his stuff, is that whenever some creationist cites a primary source, I want to see it. Not a secondary thing, not an analysis of something where they're just in-house, but an external science source, especially if it sounds like too good to be true, where it's really supporting their case really, really well. Read it and find out, because most of the time you're going to be discovering, holy moly, it's wrong. So anyway, I've gone way over line. Thank you, Shannon. It was absolutely delightful to hear, even though it was like pus coming out the ears, to listen to stupid from Jeanson. It was informative stupid.
Because there's still so much more of that garbage.
We got to do more shows on this. We've got to do more shows on this stuff, because
let me know. I'll prepare more excerpts for you. I feel like my job on this stream was just to read excerpts and just see what happened.
and believe me, it's extremely useful, because he, in every case so far, you have seen that he brings up a topic that actually relates to a bigger topic, and he's not looking into it. He's not investigating it. He's keeping it at arm's length. And so you're literally seeing him push data off the field. Yep. And if you don't know that he's doing that, you're going to think, oh, you see, this sounds so solid because it's got nouns and verbs and direct objects and a period at the end. It's very solid, isn't it?
No, I know. It's written by somebody with a PhD, and he has citations. Yeah. Just look at them. There's so many references.
Yeah. Do a
assertion jigsaw puzzle.
If you can, just count up. And if you can make a list of it, even better. I would be surprised how many there are of the actual technical science papers he does cite, not external material. I'd really love to know that.
So you mean I can't use the Answers Research Journal, because that's gonna limit me?
It won't qualify because in my measurements, I've been saying about 80 at the moment. I got about 8,500 anti-evolution sources in my reference base, and they have cited altogether a bit over 3,000 technical papers. Now, that's compared to a field of nearly 24,000 technical papers that I have in my data field.
Right.
So I can literally measure that even at a gross level, they're missing 85% of the data. And then when you look at the detail level of how they're using the source, dated material, obsolete material, authority quoting, and all the rest, or completely missing the point like Denton, that they're functionally missing 90% of the data field. And in the case of the reptile-mammal transition, they're literally missing 100% of the data field. So to get those little measurement blips down would really be a useful little blip, because there now you're now literally measuring the science base that he's attempting to build off of, and then you can use that as a superstructure to investigate how he's using those primary sources.
Right.
And I bet you it ain't going to look good. Okay, well, I'll be shutting. Let me put my little back logo here up. Let me do another stupid screen share. And I do this every single time because it takes forever for me to click the stupid thing to get the screen sharing. There we go. And there's the my little Trouble in Paradise logo that Peter from Holland put up. Yay! Gives that vague steampunk vibe, which connects up with my other thing. And so I'd like to thank Jackson, who had to slip away because he had some other things to do down there in Louisiana. And thank you, Sharon, for coming in and giving us the reading list of the nincompoop. And I definitely want to do more with you on that. And now we will be saying au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, aloha.